Emily Cross and Lacey Moore were inseparable, until one of them ended up buried in a shallow grave, and the other was caught flirting with investigators while pretending to grieve. Emily Cross and Lacey Moore had the kind of friendship people envied. They met during their sophomore year of high school in a small Oregon town, instantly bonding over music, art, and a shared dream of leaving behind their sleepy suburb for something bigger. By their 20s, they were living together in a cozy two-bedroom apartment not far from where they grew up, still sharing inside jokes and matching coffee mugs. Their social media pages were filled with photos of the two of them, road trips, beach days, party nights, and endless selfies that always ended with "March and besties for life." To everyone who knew them, they seemed more like sisters than friends. But behind those picture-perfect moments, things weren't quite so harmonious. Over time, the differences between them began to create cracks in their relationship. Lacey was ambitious, grounded, and soft-spoken. She had a job in public relations and was steadily moving up in her company. Emily, on the other hand, was more erratic. She bounced between part-time jobs, occasionally took acting classes, and spent a lot of time cultivating her online image. Where Lacey focused on stability, Emily craved attention. Tension built slowly, almost invisibly. Friends occasionally noticed snide comments, moments of awkward silence, and the way Emily seemed to glare when Lacey spoke about her successes. Still, they brushed it off. Best friends fight sometimes, they thought, and Lacey, ever the peacemaker, never mentioned anything troubling. If she had concerns, she kept them to herself. Then, in March, Lacey was promoted to a project lead role at her firm, her biggest career step yet. Around the same time, she began dating someone new, a man named Cole. What most people didn't know was that Emily had briefly dated Cole a couple of years earlier. It hadn't been serious, but Emily never quite let go. Seeing Lacey and Cole together reopened old wounds. Though she smiled in their Instagram comments and even joined them for dinner once, Emily was seething inside. By April, the tension had reached its peak. Emily started complaining that Lacey was becoming distant. She told mutual friends that Lacey had changed, that she was becoming arrogant and secretive. In truth, Lacey had simply been spending more time with Cole and focusing on her career. But Emily took it personally. She began keeping tabs on Lacey, watching when she left the apartment, reading her messages when she left her phone unlocked, and writing things in a private journal she kept under her bed. Something was festering, growing darker with each passing day. The jealousy had curdled into resentment, and soon it became something far more dangerous, but no one could see it. To everyone else, Emily was still the smiling, bubbly best friend, posting happy photos of weekend brunches and tagging Lacey in heart-filled captions. And then, on April 17th, Lacey didn't show up to work. She didn't answer her phone. She didn't return home. It would take days for the panic to set in, and even longer for the truth to come out. But the perfect friendship that had charmed an entire town was already shattered. One of them was gone and the other was hiding a secret. When Lacey Moore was reported missing, the community was stunned. Friends, family, co-workers, everyone who knew her, described her as dependable, responsible, and calm. She wasn't the type to disappear without warning. Her phone had gone dark. She hadn't posted on social media or contacted anyone, not even her new boyfriend. Her car was parked outside the apartment she shared with Emily Cross, untouched since the night she vanished. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, nothing that immediately suggested foul play. But something felt wrong. Emily was the first person police spoke to. She appeared cooperative from the start. She said Lacey had gone out for an evening walk after a minor argument and never returned. She offered small emotional details like how Lacey left without her jacket and hadn't taken her keys. Emily cried during the interview, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, saying she feared something terrible had happened. But even from the early stages, investigators noticed that her behavior didn't quite fit the situation. While volunteers organized, search parties and the police began canvassing the area, Emily threw herself into the spotlight. She went on local news stations to plead for information. She organized vigils and fundraisers. She printed posters with Lacey's face on them and passed them out with a forced smile. She answered every reporter's question with a mix of charm and sadness, making sure the camera always caught her best angles. The more attention she received, the more animated she became. Detectives noticed that during interviews, Emily often drifted off topic. She asked officers about their lives, complimented their clothes, and laughed at inappropriate moments. She wore tight dresses and heavy makeup, even when walking through the woods during search efforts. Some officers described her as oddly flirtatious, smiling too much, leaning in too close, maintaining eye contact longer than necessary. At first, it was chalked up to stress, but the behavior became more exaggerated as days passed. Behind the scenes, friends of Lacey began sharing quiet concerns. A few had heard Emily making subtle digs about Lacey's promotion and her new relationship. Others had seen signs of envy long before Lacey vanished. Still, without any physical evidence or a body, investigators had little to go on. The case stalled. The real break came from Lacey's phone records. Police obtained her digital data and noticed her phone had stopped transmitting signals near a remote state park, several miles from town, late on the night she disappeared. When reviewing traffic cameras and surveillance footage, they found something they didn't expect. Both Lacey and Emily had been seen entering the park in Emily's car just before midnight. Hours later, only Emily returned. That discovery shifted everything. It contradicted Emily's story completely. She had never mentioned going to the park. She had said Lacey left alone on foot. Now, investigators had proof she'd been with her and hadn't told anyone. The calm, cooperative roommate suddenly looked very different. Suspicion turned to certainty. Something terrible had happened in those woods, and Emily was no longer just a grieving friend. The search of the state park began at dawn. It was a dense wooded area with winding trails, steep slopes, and thick underbrush, easy to get lost in, and even easier to hide something. Dozens of officers, cadaver dogs, and volunteers spread out across the grounds, following the trail where Lacey's phone had last pinged. It took 2 days of exhaustive searching before they found what they were looking for. Near a dry creek bed, partially concealed beneath a decaying log and a layer of moss, searchers discovered a shallow grave. The ground had been disturbed, the soil loosely packed, with a faint, sour odor lingering in the air. Inside, wrapped crudely in a blue plastic tarp, was the body of a young woman. The hands were bound with duct tape, and her head showed signs of blunt force trauma. Though decomposition had set in, dental records confirmed what everyone feared. It was Lacey Moore. News of the discovery spread quickly. The community's hopeful waiting turned to stunned silence. Vigils turned into memorials. And Emily, once again, positioned herself in front of cameras. She claimed to be devastated. She wore black, dabbed tears from dry eyes, and repeated phrases like, "She was my sister and I just want justice." But behind the dramatic gestures, investigators saw something else: control, performance, and an unsettling calm. As forensic teams processed the gravesite, more inconsistencies emerged. The tarp used to wrap Lacey's body had a specific pattern sold by only a few local hardware stores. A nearby piece of duct tape contained strands of blonde hair, consistent with Emily's. Shoe impressions near the scene matched a pair of sneakers she owned. But it wasn't just the physical evidence. It was her behavior, the lies, the omissions, and how none of her actions aligned with genuine grief. Emily had never mentioned going to the park. She had never explained why both she and Lacey were seen entering together, or why she returned alone hours later. When confronted with this footage, she feigned confusion, claiming memory lapses and emotional trauma. But investigators weren't convinced. Her story was crumbling. Back at her apartment, police obtained a warrant and conducted a thorough search. Hidden in a closet were hiking boots with soil that matched samples from the gravesite. In a storage bin beneath her bed, they found rope, gloves, and a small roll of the same tarp used to wrap Lacey. But the most disturbing discovery was a notebook, stuffed beneath old bills and receipts. In it were pages of messy, scattered thoughts. Some were angry ramblings about betrayal and abandonment. Others seemed almost rehearsed, like lines from a script. One entry, dated just days before Lacey vanished, read, She doesn't deserve it. She takes everything, even him. The evidence painted a clear picture. Lacey hadn't gone missing. She had been taken, killed, and buried by someone she trusted, and that someone had returned to her life, to the cameras, and to the police, acting as if nothing had happened. Emily was no longer a witness or a grieving friend. She was now the prime suspect in a cold-blooded murder. The pressure was closing in on Emily Cross. The more investigators uncovered, the harder it became for her to keep up appearances. Yet, even as the evidence piled up, she continued to act like everything was under control. She still smiled when entering the station for questioning, still touched the arms of detectives in conversation, still offered to help any way she could. But behind her polished exterior, the truth was unraveling fast. When police obtained her phone and laptop, they discovered incriminating search history. Days before Lacey disappeared, Emily had looked up topics like how to make a murder look like an accident, how long before a body smells, and how to act innocent in police interviews. The searches were chilling, and they told a clear story. Lacey's death wasn't a moment of passion or a tragic accident. It was planned. Investigators also spoke to Cole, the man Lacey had recently started dating. He told them something they hadn't heard before. Emily had reached out to him a week before Lacey vanished. She claimed Lacey was unstable, manipulative, and possibly cheating on him. She warned him not to trust her. He had brushed it off at the time, but now it took on a more sinister meaning. It seemed Emily had been trying to sabotage the relationship before taking even more drastic action. As police assembled their case, they dug deeper into Emily's past. Former classmates and friends came forward with odd stories, how Emily often lied about small things, how she seemed obsessed with being the center of attention, and how she could turn cruel when she didn't get what she wanted. One former roommate described her as sweet at first, but there was always something off behind the smile. Another said she had once staged a fake emergency to get out of work, just to see how many people would message her with concern. Inside the interrogation room, Emily still played the part. She denied everything, claimed to be the victim of a misunderstanding, and even tried joking with the lead detective. She commented on his tie, his cologne, even asked if he was single. But none of it worked anymore. Her charm was no longer disarming. It was disturbing. The final piece came when forensic testing confirmed that fibers from Emily's jacket were found inside the tarp used to wrap Lacey's body. A soil analysis confirmed that particles from the state park were embedded in her car's wheel wells and trunk liner. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was proof. The district attorney authorized an arrest warrant. On a Friday morning, police showed up at Emily's apartment with a full team. She didn't run, she didn't cry. She asked if she could change clothes before going with them. As cameras filmed her being led away in handcuffs, she lifted her chin, smirked, and looked directly into the lens. Emily Cross had performed her way through the investigation, using charm, lies, and manipulation to mask what she had done. But now the performance was over. The mask had cracked, the truth had surfaced, and justice was finally catching up. The trial of Emily Cross became a national spectacle. What began as a local tragedy had grown into a disturbing true crime phenomenon, and the courtroom was packed with reporters, community members, and even strangers drawn in by the eerie twists of the case. Emily arrived each day with her hair perfectly styled and her outfits carefully chosen. She smiled at the cameras, waved to onlookers, and looked more like someone attending a premiere than someone facing a lifetime behind bars. Her behavior didn't change. She was still performing. The prosecution presented a chilling narrative. They laid out the timeline of events in precise detail. Lacey's promotion, her new relationship, Emily's increasing resentment, the premeditated trip to the state park, and the digital trail that revealed Emily's every move. They showed the internet searches from her devices, the surveillance footage of the two women entering the park together, and the forensic evidence that linked Emily directly to the burial site. But the most powerful piece of evidence was Emily's journal, pages filled with rage, jealousy, and thinly veiled threats. One line read aloud in court, left the room in stunned silence. She got the job, the guy, and now she'll get what's coming to her. Emily's defense team tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial. They painted her as an emotionally unstable young woman who had suffered a mental breakdown after years of stress and insecurity. They claimed she had no history of violence and had simply been overwhelmed by feelings of abandonment. But the jury wasn't convinced. Witness after witness testified to Emily's manipulative tendencies. Former friends described how she thrived on attention, how she twisted stories to suit her needs, and how quickly she turned cold when she wasn't the center of everything. Even more damning was the testimony from Cole, who recounted Emily's bizarre messages just days before Lacey's death. Messages now seen as a desperate attempt to regain control over someone slipping away from her. The prosecution emphasized that this wasn't a crime of passion. It was deliberate, it was personal, and it was planned. Emily showed little emotion throughout the trial. She listened to the testimony, tilted her head when the jury was addressed, and occasionally jotted notes in a pink notebook. When the guilty verdict was finally read, she didn't cry. She didn't react at all. Instead, she glanced toward the gallery, caught sight of the cameras, and smiled. One final performance. The judge sentenced Emily to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In his closing remarks, he said she had shown an astonishing lack of remorse and described her actions as chillingly calculated. Outside the courthouse, Lacey's family stood silently, holding a photo of the daughter and sister they had lost. They didn't speak to the press. They didn't need to. The truth had finally been revealed. Emily Cross would never walk free again. The woman who tried to flirt her way out of justice, who smiled through her lies and buried her best friend beneath the trees, was now behind bars, alone, unmasked, and remembered not for her charm, but for her crime.